A 9-year-old black girl is brutally arrested and sentenced to life in prison for a crime she did not commit. Years later, the truth comes out, and the consequences shock everyone. Subscribe right in the comments where you're watching this video from. The day began like any other in Layla's world, where warmth radiated from every corner of her family's modest, sunlit home. She awoke each morning to the soft murmur of her parents' voices, discussing the day's plans and whispering dreams about the future they wanted for her. Layla's mother would always ruffle her curly hair playfully, smiling as she prepared breakfast, while her father would share stories of courage, hope, and equality, laying the foundation of Layla's understanding of a world she barely knew. At 9 years old, Layla was curious, bright, and bursting with dreams. Her family nurtured this curiosity, feeding her mind with books, nature outings, and endless discussions about life, values, and justice. Her mother was a nurse, and her father, a history teacher, often shared stories from the lives of great leaders who fought for freedom and justice. Layla admired her parents deeply, envisioning a life where she too would make a difference. She dreamed of becoming a doctor, not just to cure ailments, but to be a helper and protector, just like her mother. To Layla, her family was her entire world, one filled with love, strength, and unwavering support. Layla's days were simple, but brimming with joy. Her parents took her to the local park, where they watched as she scrambled over rocks and raced around, her laughter filling the air. On rainy days, they would huddle together under a blanket, reading stories and sharing dreams. Her father encouraged her to ask questions, to be bold and fearless, and her mother always reminded her of the importance of kindness and empathy. But, as Layla was soon to learn, life could change in a single, unforgiven moment. One winter evening, while driving back from a family outing, the car veered unexpectedly on an icy road. Layla's memory of that night was a blur of sounds, the shattering of glass, the shrill cry of metal twisting, and her mother's voice whispering her name. She remembered the silence that followed, a deafening, endless silence that swallowed everything she had ever known. When she regained consciousness, Layla found herself in a sterile hospital room, her small hands wrapped in bandages. She ached all over, but the pain in her heart was greater than any physical wound. Her parents, the pillars of her life, were gone, taken from her in an instant. She was alone in a world that suddenly felt cold and unrecognizable. Every comforting routine, every gentle touch, every whispered word of encouragement was now a memory. She was a 9-year-old girl lost in a vast, frightening void. The weeks that followed were a haze of faces and voices. Social workers, doctors, distant relatives who offered condolences, but seemed uneasy in her presence. Layla felt herself being shuffled from one place to another, a nameless figure in a system that felt indifferent to her grief and loneliness. She clung to the few memories of her parents, replaying their voices in her head, their words of hope, of justice, as if they could guide her through this nightmare. Eventually, Layla was placed in a state orphanage. It was a cold, impersonal institution where children's laughter was seldom heard, and compassion was scarce. Each day was a rigid cycle of meals, chores, and curfews, devoid of warmth and affection. Layla's vibrant spirit, once so full of curiosity and dreams, now felt stifled. The world that her parents had so lovingly built around her had crumbled, leaving her to navigate the harsh realities of a place that saw her as just another file, another mouth to feed. In the orphanage, Layla encountered the harshness of the world her parents had shielded her from. The older children taunted her for her curly hair and quiet demeanor, sneering at her dreams of becoming a doctor. She quickly learned to withdraw, to keep her thoughts and dreams hidden. Each night, she clutched a worn photo of her parents, holding on to their memory like a lifeline, trying to recall every lesson they had taught her, every story they had shared. After several months, Layla was placed with a foster family. It was a temporary arrangement, the social worker had told her, but to Layla, it felt like a sentence. Her new guardians, the Smiths, were a distant, indifferent couple who saw her presence as an obligation rather than a joy. The Smiths lived in a run-down part of town, a place where Layla's dreams felt even more out of reach. Her days were spent in a cramped apartment where she was expected to stay out of the way, to remain quiet and unseen. At her new school, Layla quickly learned that her world had changed in more ways than one. The children in her class treated her with suspicion and disdain, whispering behind her back and casting glances that made her skin crawl. She was the foster kid, the orphan, the outsider who didn't belong. Her teachers, though polite, seemed to regard her with pity rather than genuine concern. Layla tried her best to keep to herself, to focus on her studies, but the weight of her isolation pressed down on her, growing heavier each day. Her only solace was the small collection of books she had managed to gather from the library. Each evening, she would retreat to her room, immersing herself in stories of courage and resilience, imagining that she, too, could find strength in a world that seemed determined to crush her spirit. She remembered her father's words, his lessons about justice and fairness, and clung to the belief that somehow, someday, she would find a way to rise above her circumstances. But as time passed, Layla began to realize that the world outside her family's embrace was not the place of fairness and equality her parents had taught her to believe in. She saw the casual cruelty in the eyes of her classmates, the indifference in the faces of the adults who surrounded her. Her once bright, trusting heart began to harden, her innocence chipped away piece by painful piece. One rainy afternoon, while on her way back from school, Layla entered a small neighborhood grocery store to buy a snack. She carefully counted her coins, hoping they would be enough for a small treat. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the commotion near the entrance as two older boys dashed out, clutching bags of stolen goods. The store manager, an irritable man with a permanent scowl, spotted Layla near the shelves and assumed she was with them. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" he barked, his voice echoing through the store. Layla froze, confusion clouding her face. She turned slowly, clutching her few coins, her heart pounding as the manager's angry glare bore into her. I didn't do anything," she stammered, trying to explain, but the man was already on her, his rough hand gripping her arm tightly. "I saw you with them. Don't think you can fool me," he sneered, dragging her toward the door. Layla's protests fell on deaf ears, her pleas swallowed by the manager's accusations. She was pushed roughly outside, her mind reeling, her heart sinking as she realized that no one would listen to her. The police arrived minutes later. 2 officers, including a tall, gruff man named Officer Carter, approached her with cold, unfeeling eyes. Carter sized her up with a glance, his expression one of contempt as he asked the manager for a recount of the events. The man wasted no time embellishing his story, painting Layla as an accomplice to the theft, a troublemaker who had been caught in the act. Layla's voice trembled as she tried to explain, her words stumbling over each other as she pleaded her innocence. But Officer Carter's gaze was unwavering, his mind already made up. To him, Layla was just another kid from a bad neighborhood, just another troublemaker who needed to be taught a lesson. "Enough," he interrupted, his voice sharp and dismissive. "We've heard enough." Before Layla could react, cold steel cuffs closed around her wrists, their harsh metal biting into her skin. Her heart raced as she realized the gravity of her situation, as the weight of the system began to press down on her small shoulders. The world around her blurred, her mind spiraling into confusion and terror as she was led toward the waiting police car. As the rain poured down, Layla sat in the back seat, her body trembling, her thoughts racing. She was trapped, ensnared by a system that saw her as nothing more than a statistic, a problem to be dealt with swiftly and without mercy. In that moment, she felt the last fragments of her innocence slipping away, leaving her with the bitter taste of betrayal and a heart heavy with despair. And in that moment, Layla's world was forever changed, leaving her standing on the precipice of a nightmare she could never have imagined. The day of Layla's arrest marked the beginning of a descent into an unforgiven world where her innocence held no weight against the prejudices stacked against her. After the incident at the grocery store, she found herself thrust into a cold and indifferent system, one that barely recognized her as a child. She was transferred to a holding cell within the police station, a sterile, impersonal place with gray walls and a single, flickering light that cast harsh shadows around her. The room was silent, save for the distant hum of voices beyond the locked door. Hours passed with no one coming to check on her, no one explaining what was going to happen. Alone in the stark, unfamiliar space, Layla felt fear take root deep inside her. Her hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. Her mind replayed the events over and over, each time hoping for a different outcome, each time unable to change the crushing reality. Finally, a police officer entered. He didn't look at her, his face set in a rigid mask of indifference as he placed a tray of food in front of her. Layla looked up at him, wanting to explain, to plead for someone to listen, but his eyes didn't meet hers, and he was gone before she could say a word. The following day, she was brought to a sterile, dimly lit interrogation room. A tall officer with a stern face, Officer Carter, the same man who had arrested her, entered, followed by another man who looked like he hadn't smiled in years. They sat across from her, both with expressions that spoke of boredom and disdain. Officer Carter leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "All right, kid," he said, his voice hard and dismissive. "Why don't you start talking?" Layla's voice was a faint whisper as she tried to explain. She told them how she had just been in the store, how she had no idea who the boys were, and how she hadn't stolen anything. But each word seemed to fall into an endless void of indifference. The two men exchanged glances, and she could see the lack of belief in their eyes, as if they had already decided her guilt before she even entered the room. "Sure," the second officer sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "You expect us to believe that? Just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, is that it?" Layla felt the unfairness of it all pressing down on her. Her parents had taught her that justice was something everyone was entitled to, that every person deserved a fair chance. But here, in this cold room with these unfeeling faces, she felt small, insignificant. Her words didn't matter, and her pleas for understanding went unanswered. Officer Carter shook his head, a condescending smirk on his face. "You kids from these neighborhoods always have a story. Let me tell you something, young lady, no one's going to buy it." As he spoke, Layla felt the sting of humiliation, the crushing realization that no one here cared about her innocence. They saw her as nothing more than a statistic, a girl from a low-income background who, in their eyes, was bound to get into trouble sooner or later. They weren't interested in her truth. They only wanted to see her as they'd already decided she was. Her voice broke as she tried once more. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong. I swear I didn't." But Officer Carter only sighed, a look of annoyance crossing his face. "Enough. We've heard all we need to hear." In the silence that followed, Layla realized that this was it. Her chance to be heard, to be understood, had passed. The door closed behind them, leaving her alone with the cold, crushing weight of their words echoing in her mind. The next time someone came to see her, it wasn't a sympathetic social worker or a concerned guardian. Instead, it was another officer who led her to a large, austere courtroom. Layla's eyes widened as she took in the intimidating space, the high ceilings and rows of wooden benches filled with unfamiliar faces. Her heart pounded as she realized that this would be the place where her future would be decided by people who knew nothing of her life, her character, or her innocence. Her assigned lawyer was a young, overworked public defender who barely glanced at her as they took their seats. He didn't ask her any questions or try to comfort her. Instead, he shuffled through a stack of papers, his expression resigned, as if he'd already accepted the outcome of her case. Layla looked at him, hoping for some acknowledgement, some sign that someone here cared about what would happen to her, but he remained distant, preoccupied, and she felt her last hopes flicker and fade. When the judge entered, Layla's heart sank. He was an older man, Judge James Collins, known for his harsh sentences and his lack of leniency toward juvenile offenders. His gaze was cold and unforgiving as he looked down at her, barely concealing his disdain. In that moment, Layla felt a wave of helplessness wash over her, a sense of being utterly alone in a room full of people who had already judged her. The trial was brief, almost perfunctory. The store manager testified, his story exaggerated and filled with half-truths, painting Layla as a cunning thief who had tried to get away with stolen goods. The officers added their testimonies, and their words only reinforced the image of Layla as a troublemaker, a child from a disadvantaged neighborhood who had been caught red-handed. No one questioned the validity of their statements. No one asked for more details. When it was finally her turn to speak, Layla's voice trembled as she looked around the courtroom, seeing only cold, unfeeling faces. She spoke softly, explaining as best as she could, but the judge seemed uninterested, his eyes fixed on the clock as if eager to move on to the next case. The defense attorney offered little in the way of support, merely reiterating her statement without adding anything substantial to her defense. It was clear to Layla that he saw her as nothing more than another case in his endless workload, another child with a doomed fate. After a few short minutes of deliberation, Judge Collins delivered his verdict. His words were sharp, merciless, and without compassion. "Given the evidence presented," he intoned, "I find the defendant guilty of theft and attempted conspiracy. I believe it is necessary to set an example, to deter others from making similar choices. Therefore, I'm sentencing you to life imprisonment. This will serve as a lesson to others who believe they can undermine the law." The courtroom fell silent as the weight of the judge's words settled over them. Layla's eyes widened, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Life imprisonment? She was only a child, a girl who had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, sentenced to spend the rest of her life behind bars. Her heart pounded as the reality of her situation crashed over her, drowning her in a sense of hopelessness she had never known. She looked at her lawyer, hoping he would protest, that he would stand up for her, but he only shrugged, his gaze averted. The officers who had testified against her exchanged glances, their expressions indifferent, as if her fate were nothing more than a passing inconvenience. Layla's voice broke as she whispered, "Please, I didn't do it." But no one listened. The judge had already turned away, the courtroom emptying as her life was condemned to the shadows. They took her back to the holding cell, the gravity of her sentence pressing down on her with a weight she could barely bear. The thought of spending her life in prison was incomprehensible, a nightmare from which there was no escape. The days blurred together, each one a repeat of the last, filled with cold stares, harsh words, and the silent acceptance of her fate by those around her. At night, she lay awake, haunted by the memories of her parents, their voices fading as the harsh reality of her new life took hold. She wondered what they would think, how they would have fought for her if they were still alive. She remembered the stories her father had told her, stories of justice and equality, but those ideals felt distant now, like dreams from a world she no longer belonged to. The following days were filled with procedural formalities, each one serving as a reminder of the life she would never have. The officers treated her with casual disdain, escorting her through the motions without a shred of compassion. They saw her as a statistic, a number in the system, another criminal who had been dealt with. When the day came for her to be transferred to the prison, Layla felt a hollow numbness settle over her. She barely registered the cold handcuffs on her wrists, the indifferent stares of the guards, or the darkened windows of the van that would carry her away from everything she had ever known. She felt like a ghost, a shadow of the person she had once been, as the last remnants of her childhood were stripped away, leaving her with nothing but the empty promise of a life spent behind bars. As the van rumbled down the road, Layla stared out at the cityscape, her heart aching with a longing she couldn't put into words. She thought of her parents, of the dreams they had for her, and of the life she would never live. And in that moment, a spark of determination began to form deep within her, a faint glimmer of resistance that refused to be extinguished. Layla's world had descended into an endless cycle of disbelief, confusion, and fear. The cold metal of handcuffs pressed into her small wrists, biting into her skin as Officer Carter led her out of the police station. His grip was firm and unyielding, as if she might slip away at any moment, as if she were some dangerous criminal rather than a frightened child. Layla's heart raced as she looked around, catching glimpses of people in the street staring, murmuring to each other, some shaking their heads. "Come on," Carter said gruffly, his voice dripping with irritation. "You're making a scene. Move it." Layla's cheeks burned with shame as she stumbled forward, trying to keep up with his brisk pace. Her mind was still spinning, replaying the moment in the grocery store over and over. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't even known the boys who had run past her, but none of that mattered now. In the eyes of Officer Carter and the world around her, she was guilty. The police car loomed ahead, and with a rough tug, Carter opened the door, shoving her inside without a word. Layla's small frame sank into the hard seat, her hands still cuffed in front of her. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the low hum of the engine as they pulled away from the station. As they drove, Layla looked out the window, her eyes wide with fear. The city whizzed by in a blur of colors and sounds, but it all felt distant, as though she were watching from a place outside herself. The life she had known, the love and warmth of her family, seemed like a distant memory now, something fragile and far away. She could almost hear her mother's voice, her father's laughter, but it felt like trying to grasp smoke. "Stop looking so miserable." Carter's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and unforgiving. "Maybe if you'd thought twice about what you were doing, you wouldn't be in this mess." Layla looked up, her eyes meeting his in the rearview mirror. "But I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Carter scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, sure. That's what they all say." He didn't look at her again, his focus fixed on the road as they continued in silence. They arrived at a juvenile detention facility on the edge of the city. The building was imposing, with tall fences topped with razor wire that gleamed under the dull afternoon light. Layla's heart pounded as they pulled up to the entrance, her gaze fixed on the cold, gray walls that seemed to close in on her. "Out," Carter ordered, yanking the car door open. He didn't wait for her to move. Instead, he grabbed her arm and pulled her out roughly. Layla stumbled, barely managing to keep her balance as he led her toward the facility entrance. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and cold metal filled the air, a stark reminder of the sterile and unfeeling nature of the place. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glow, illuminating the drab, featureless walls and the blank, indifferent faces of the guards who watched her arrival with bored expressions. Carter guided her down a long, narrow hallway lined with heavy metal doors. The sound of each step echoed, the only noise in the oppressive silence. Layla felt a knot of dread forming in her stomach, her breath quickening as they approached one of the doors. A female guard appeared, her face devoid of any empathy or understanding. She looked at Layla with the same indifferent gaze, as though she were nothing more than another case file, another number in the system. "Take her to processing," Carter said to the guard, handing over a clipboard. He shot Layla one last disdainful look. "Maybe this will teach you a lesson," he muttered before turning and walking away. Layla's heart sank as she watched him disappear down the hallway. She felt small, powerless, like a leaf caught in a storm, tossed around without any say in where she would end up. The female guard led her to a small room with a stark, clinical setup. A hard, plastic chair sat in the middle, and a camera was mounted on the wall. Layla's hands were uncuffed, and she was instructed to sit still as the guard took her photograph, the flash blinding her momentarily. The sound of the camera click was deafening in the silence, each flash capturing her frightened expression, a moment frozen in time. After the photos, they took her fingerprints. Her hands shook as she pressed each finger onto the ink pad, leaving black smudges on her skin. She felt humiliated, her dignity stripped away piece by piece as the guard worked with cold, mechanical efficiency, treating her as though she were something less than human. Once the processing was finished, they handed her a standard-issue uniform, a drab gray jumpsuit that felt scratchy against her skin. She was led to a small, barren room that served as her cell. The door clanged shut behind her, the sound reverberating through her chest. She was alone, locked away from the world, with only her thoughts and fears for company. Layla sat on the narrow cot, hugging her knees to her chest. The room was stark and devoid of warmth, with nothing but the cot, a small metal sink, and a toilet in the corner. There were no windows, no glimpses of the outside world, only the relentless, unfeeling gray walls that seemed to close in on her. She spent the next several hours in silence, her mind racing with questions, with confusion and despair. How could this be happening? How could she be locked away, treated like a criminal when she had done nothing wrong? She felt the weight of her helplessness, the crushing reality of her situation pressing down on her like an unbearable burden. The hours dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. She lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and sadness. She thought of her parents, of the warmth and love they had given her, and the tears came, silent and unending. The following day, a new reality set in, a reality filled with strict routines, harsh treatment, and a complete lack of compassion. Layla was woken early by a guard who barked orders with a voice that left no room for hesitation. She was escorted to the cafeteria, a sterile, uninviting space filled with rows of tables and chairs bolted to the floor. The other children, dressed in the same gray uniforms, sat in silence, their faces blank, their eyes dull. Layla could see the weight of their own struggles etched in their expressions, the hopelessness that came from being trapped in a place that seemed designed to strip them of their humanity. As she sat down with her tray, filled with bland, tasteless food, she tried to ignore the stares from the other children. She kept her head down, eating mechanically, the food tasteless and unappealing. Every bite felt like swallowing sand, but she forced herself to eat, knowing that she needed her strength. When breakfast was over, they were led to a classroom for mandatory lessons. The teacher was stern and uninterested, reading from a textbook in a monotone voice that made the lessons feel more like a punishment than an opportunity to learn. Layla struggled to focus, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. She felt disconnected from herself, as though she were watching her life from a distance, powerless to change its course. Days blurred into each other, each one a repetition of the last. Layla found herself sinking deeper into despair, her once bright spirit dulled by the relentless monotony and the harsh treatment. She kept to herself, avoiding eye contact with the other children, her silence a shield against the pain of her reality. One evening, as she lay in her cell, staring at the ceiling, a thought began to take shape, a faint, fragile glimmer of hope. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, his words about justice and fairness, about standing up for what was right. Layla's parents had taught her that the world wasn't always fair, but they had also taught her that she had a voice, that she could fight for herself and for what was just. The thought grew, blossoming into a tiny seed of determination. She couldn't let herself be swallowed by this place, by this injustice. She had to find a way to make her voice heard, to prove her innocence, even if the world seemed determined to ignore her. Layla spent the following days clinging to that thought, nurturing it like a fragile flame. She began to observe everything around her, paying attention to the routines, to the guards' movements, to the whispers of the other children. She started to form a plan, though it was still vague, a faint outline that gave her a sense of purpose. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the world outside her cell might still see her as guilty, but she refused to give up. Her parents' lessons, their words of hope and justice, remained with her, a beacon in the darkness that surrounded her. And, as she lay on her cot, clutching her memories close, Layla made a silent promise to herself. She would not let this place, this system, define her. She would fight, even if she had to do it alone. The day of Layla's trial arrived with a bitter chill in the air, matching the dread that had settled deep within her. She was escorted from the juvenile detention center, her hands cuffed once again, her small figure dwarfed by the towering officers who led her through the hallways. She was told to sit and wait in a cold, windowless room just outside the courtroom. The silence was broken only by the shuffling of paperwork and murmured conversations of the guards outside. Layla sat alone, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind was a swirl of thoughts and questions, each one laced with fear and desperation. What would happen to her? Would anyone listen? Her parents had taught her to believe in fairness, in the idea that every person deserved to be heard. But after everything she'd been through, that belief felt fragile and distant. She was a child facing a world that seemed intent on seeing her as guilty. The door opened, and a man she recognized from their brief encounter entered the room, her public defender, Mr. Thomas. He was a young, weary-looking man with dark circles under his eyes, and he wore a tired expression as he flipped through the papers in his hand. He glanced at her briefly before sitting down across from her, his expression one of resigned indifference. "Layla, right," he said, not looking up from his papers. Layla nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "Look," Mr. Thomas began, finally meeting her eyes. "I don't know what your story is, but I have to be honest with you. This case, it's not looking good." Her heart sank at his words. She could feel the weight of despair pressing down on her, suffocating any last shreds of hope she might have had. She wanted to scream, to tell him that she was innocent, that she hadn't done anything wrong, but his expression told her that he'd already made up his mind, that he didn't truly care. "They've got witness testimonies, and the judge, well, he's not exactly known for leniency," Mr. Thomas continued, his voice monotone. "Judge Collins is tough on cases like yours, so you should prepare yourself. I'll do what I can, but there's only so much we can hope for." Layla's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers twisting together as her mind struggled to process his words. She was going to stand in front of a judge who already believed she was guilty, and her own lawyer seemed indifferent to her innocence. The world around her felt cold and hostile, like an enemy she couldn't fight. A guard knocked on the door and signaled to Mr. Thomas. "Time to go in." Without waiting for a response, the guard opened the door, and Mr. Thomas rose, motioning for her to follow. Layla took a deep breath, summoning what little courage she had left, and stepped into the hallway, her small steps echoing against the hard floor as they made their way to the courtroom. The courtroom was imposing, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches that seemed to stretch endlessly. Layla felt a chill as she stepped inside, her gaze drifting over the unfamiliar faces that turned to look at her. She was led to a small bench next to Mr. Thomas, who barely glanced in her direction as he shuffled through his notes, his expression indifferent. At the front of the courtroom sat Judge James Collins. He was an older man with a stern, unforgiving face and sharp, piercing eyes that held no trace of empathy. His reputation preceded him. He was known for his harsh judgments and his unwavering belief in the law, regardless of the circumstances. Layla felt her stomach twist with fear as his gaze settled on her, cold and calculating, as if he'd already measured her worth and found it wanting. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with an air of authority, stood up and began her opening statement, her voice confident and forceful. She painted a picture of Layla as a troubled child from a disadvantaged background, someone who had already begun down the path of delinquency. Her words were laced with assumptions and stereotypes, each one piercing Layla like a shard of glass. She wanted to protest, to tell the courtroom that they didn't know her, that they didn't understand, but she knew no one here would listen. As the prosecutor continued, she called the store manager to the stand. He was the same man who had accused her that fateful day, his expression smug and self-assured as he recounted his version of events. He described her as suspicious, someone who had looked shifty and nervous. His words were exaggerated, twisted to fit the image he wanted to create, and Layla felt a wave of helplessness wash over her as he spoke. She looked at Mr. Thomas, hoping he would question the store manager, would challenge his statements, but he only offered a few half-hearted questions before allowing him to step down. It was as though her own defender didn't believe in her innocence, as though he were going through the motions simply because he had to. The officers who had arrested her were called next, their testimony equally damning. They described her behavior as uncooperative, painting her as defiant and disrespectful. Layla's voice caught in her throat as she heard their words, each one chipping away at her hope. She had tried to explain herself, to tell them the truth, but they had refused to listen, had dismissed her words as though they held no weight. When it was finally her turn to speak, Layla felt a surge of nervousness, her hands trembling as she took a deep breath. She looked up at Judge Collins, his gaze cold and unyielding, and tried to find the courage to speak. I didn't do anything wrong," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I was just in the store. I didn't steal anything. I don't even know those boys." Judge Collins watched her with an expression of skepticism, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Is that all you have to say?" he asked, his tone devoid of sympathy. Layla's voice wavered as she nodded, feeling her courage falter under his harsh scrutiny. She wanted to say more, to explain herself, but the weight of his disapproval pressed down on her, leaving her feeling small and defeated. The prosecutor gave her closing statement, reiterating Layla's supposed guilt and urging the judge to make an example of her. Her words were harsh, cutting, each one reinforcing the image of Layla as a dangerous child, a criminal who needed to be punished. Layla sat silently, her heart sinking with each passing moment, knowing that the outcome had already been decided. Judge Collins turned to Mr. Thomas, raising an eyebrow. "Anything to add in your client's defense?" Mr. Thomas cleared his throat, glancing briefly at Layla before looking back at the judge. "Your Honor, my client is young, and this is her first offense. I ask for leniency, considering her age and circumstances." The judge's gaze hardened, his expression unchanging. He turned to Layla, his cold eyes locking onto hers. "Youth is not an excuse for criminal behavior," he said, his voice filled with disapproval. "It is the responsibility of the court to ensure that individuals like you understand the consequences of their actions." Layla felt her chest tighten, her breath shallow as she listened to his words. She wanted to scream, to cry, to beg him to understand that she hadn't done anything wrong, but she knew it wouldn't matter. This wasn't a place of justice. It was a place of condemnation. Judge Collins straightened, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom before settling back on Layla. "Given the evidence presented," he declared, his voice echoing in the silence, "I find the defendant guilty of theft and attempted conspiracy. I believe it is necessary to set an example, to deter others from making similar choices. Therefore, I am sentencing her to life imprisonment. This will serve as a lesson to others who believe they can undermine the law." Layla's world shattered as his words registered. Life imprisonment. She could barely comprehend it. She was 9 years old, a child, and yet she was being sentenced to spend the rest of her life behind bars. Her vision blurred as the reality of her fate crashed over her, each word echoing in her mind, binding her to a future filled with darkness. She looked over at Mr. Thomas, her last hope, but he simply shook his head, his gaze avoiding hers. He was already gathering his papers, his expression distant, as if he were eager to be done with her case. The officers moved toward her, their faces impassive as they prepared to take her back to her cell. Layla's voice broke as she whispered, "Please, I didn't do it." But no one listened. The courtroom was emptying, the spectators moving on with their lives, and she was left alone in the midst of a crushing silence. Layla's days in prison began with an overwhelming sense of disbelief that quickly hardened into a painful reality. She was only 9 years old, but her life had been reduced to the cold, gray walls of her cell. The walls around her were impenetrable, lifeless, and the sounds that echoed through the hallways reminded her constantly of where she was, a place where hope was a rarity and kindness was non-existent. The first few weeks passed in a blur of new routines, each one stripped of warmth and humanity. Guards would wake her early, their voices sharp and indifferent as they barked commands. She would shuffle out of bed, her small frame lost in the oversized gray prison uniform, and follow the others down to the cafeteria. Each morning, she would receive a tray of bland, flavorless food, and she would sit alone, picking at the meal in silence. Around her, other prisoners ate quietly, their faces hardened and withdrawn. The entire room felt weighed down by an unspoken despair, the kind that seeps into your bones and refuses to let go. The other inmates, women of varying ages, mostly ignored her. To them, she was just another face among the many who had found themselves trapped here. Some looked at her with pity, others with indifference, and a few even with suspicion. They whispered about her, and while she couldn't hear what they said, she felt the sting of their judgment. They saw her as an anomaly, a child lost in a world meant for the guilty and the broken. Layla's daily life was governed by rigid rules and cold procedures. Mornings were spent in silence, moving between her cell, the cafeteria, and the few designated areas she was allowed to visit. She was often left alone, her interactions limited to the occasional stern instructions from the guards or the indifferent glances of other inmates. The monotony was crushing, each day identical to the one before, devoid of anything that could spark joy or hope. In the afternoon, she was allowed to visit the prison's small, dimly lit library. For Layla, the library became a sanctuary, a place where, even in the midst of despair, she could find a sliver of solace. The shelves were lined with dusty, worn books, most of them outdated and unremarkable. But to Layla, they were a lifeline. She would wander through the narrow aisles, her fingers tracing the spines of books that had been forgotten by everyone else, her eyes scanning titles that hinted at worlds far beyond the prison walls. One afternoon, as she searched for something new to read, her gaze fell on a thick, heavy book titled Introduction to Constitutional Law. She reached for it, curiosity flickering in her chest. The book was dense, filled with unfamiliar words and legal jargon, but as she flipped through the pages, she found herself drawn in. She didn't understand much at first, but the concept of laws, rights, and justice resonated with something deep within her, a faint reminder of her parents' teachings, of the fairness and dignity they had believed in. Over the following weeks, Layla returned to the book again and again, struggling to comprehend its meaning. The words were challenging, the concepts complex, but she was determined. She read slowly, often rereading the same passages multiple times, trying to absorb every sentence, every idea. In those moments, she felt a sense of purpose, a quiet determination that countered the despair she felt elsewhere. Months turned into years, and Layla's knowledge grew. She devoured every book she could find on law, justice, and human rights. She discovered stories of people who had fought against injustice, who had refused to let the system break them. She read about figures who had endured hardship and emerged stronger, people who had become symbols of resilience and hope. These stories became her fuel, her inspiration, and she clung to them as fiercely as she clung to the memory of her parents. During one of her visits to the library, Layla encountered someone who would change the course of her journey, a former lawyer named Raymond, an older man with graying hair and a weary face marked by years of hardship. He had been imprisoned for a moral crime, and though he had lost his freedom, he hadn't lost his knowledge or his sense of justice. He noticed Layla reading a law book, her face etched with concentration, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. "Not a lot of kids your age read constitutional law," he remarked, his voice gentle yet tinged with curiosity. Layla looked up, surprised that someone had spoken to her. She hesitated, unsure if she should respond, but something in Raymond's eyes told her that he was different, that he wasn't just another indifferent face in this prison. I want to understand it," she replied softly, her voice laced with both determination and vulnerability. Raymond chuckled softly. "Well, that's a tall order, especially for someone so young." He paused, studying her for a moment. "Why are you so interested in it?" Layla's gaze dropped to the book in her hands. She thought about the unfairness she had endured, the cold dismissal of her innocence, and the judge's harsh sentence. Because I want to understand why they did this to me. I didn't do anything wrong, and yet they treated me like a criminal." Raymond's expression softened, a flicker of empathy crossing his face. He saw in her a spark of resilience, a desire for answers that went beyond her years. "The law isn't always just," he said, his voice quiet. "Sometimes it's used to protect those in power, and other times it's used to crush those who don't have a voice." Layla absorbed his words, feeling a mix of anger and understanding. She had sensed the injustice around her, but hearing it spoken aloud gave her feelings a sense of legitimacy, a recognition that she wasn't alone in her anger. Over the next few months, Raymond became her mentor. He taught her the basics of legal principles, explaining concepts like due process, reasonable doubt, and the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. He showed her how to think critically, to question everything, and to never accept injustice as the final answer. Their conversations became a lifeline, a reminder that she still had a mind, a voice, and a right to seek the truth. Raymond shared his own story, telling her about his career as a lawyer and the choices that had led him here. He spoke of cases he had fought, victories he had won, and the mistakes that had ultimately cost him his freedom. His honesty and humility touched Layla, and she grew to trust him, finding comfort in their shared experiences and mutual understanding. Through Raymond, Layla learned not only about the law but also about the strength it took to face a world that seemed determined to tear her down. He encouraged her to keep reading, to keep learning, and to never let the prison walls define her. Together, they explored the intricacies of the legal system, dissecting cases and discussing precedents, each lesson fueling her resolve. As the years passed, Layla's knowledge grew, and so did her determination. She was no longer the frightened, helpless child who had been brought into this place. She was now a young woman with a mind sharp and focused, a heart that burned with a desire for justice. She had transformed her pain into strength, her anger into purpose, and with Raymond's guidance she began to formulate a plan to fight back, to reclaim her freedom. The day she turned 14, Layla felt a shift within her. She knew that the time had come to act, to take the knowledge she had gained and use it to challenge the system that had condemned her. She approached Raymond, her eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "I want to reopen my case," she said, her voice steady. I want to prove my innocence." Raymond studied her, a mixture of pride and caution in his gaze. He had seen her grow from a lost, frightened girl into a young woman with a fierce will, but he knew the risks she would face. The legal system was complex, and the odds were stacked against her. But he also knew that Layla was ready, that she had the strength and intelligence to fight. "All right," he replied, his voice firm, "but it won't be easy. You'll need evidence, witnesses, a solid argument. They won't make it easy for you." Layla nodded, her expression determined. "I know, but I have to try. I can't live the rest of my life in here knowing that I didn't do anything wrong." Over the following months, Layla and Raymond worked tirelessly. They combed through every detail of her case, analyzing the evidence, the testimonies, and the procedural errors that had led to her conviction. Raymond taught her how to draft legal documents, how to prepare arguments, and how to present her case with confidence and clarity. Together, they built a strategy, a foundation upon which she could stand when the time came. The other inmates watched her with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. They had seen her transform, had witnessed her dedication and resilience. Layla had become something of a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest places, hope could still survive. Finally, after years of preparation, Layla filed a petition for a retrial, citing new evidence and procedural violations in her original case. The process was long and arduous, filled with obstacles and setbacks, but Layla refused to give up. She had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let her voice be silenced once more. And as she waited for the court's response, a flicker of hope began to grow within her. She had spent half her life behind bars, but now, for the first time in years, she could see a glimmer of light, a possibility that one day she might be free. The months leading up to Layla's retrial were filled with a mix of hope, fear, and determination. For years, she had endured the grim monotony of life in prison, but now, for the first time, there was a chance, a real chance, that she might see the world outside again. Her petition for a retrial had been accepted, a remarkable feat considering her circumstances and the legal system's reluctance to revisit old cases, especially one involving a young black girl who had been so easily dismissed as guilty. Layla's days were now a blur of preparation. She and Raymond worked tirelessly, combing through every scrap of evidence, every witness statement, and every procedural detail. Their strategy was simple but solid. Expose the flaws in the original investigation, demonstrate the bias that had tainted the process from the start, and bring forward new evidence that would challenge the foundation of her conviction. But as the retrial approached, Layla knew that this journey would test her in ways she hadn't yet imagined. She was no longer that frightened 9-year-old who had been thrust into a world of cold steel bars and indifferent stares. She had grown, matured, and learned to navigate the complexities of the law. Now, she was prepared to stand up for herself, to face the people who had condemned her, and to demand the justice she had been denied. On the day of the retrial, the courtroom was filled with a tense silence. Layla entered, escorted by guards, her gaze steady and her heart beating with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Raymond walked beside her, his presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone. They took their seats, and Layla felt the weight of the room's scrutiny pressing down on her. Reporters, lawyers, and spectators had filled the benches, all curious to see this young woman who had dared to challenge the system that had imprisoned her as a child. Judge Collins, the same man who had sentenced her years before, presided over the retrial. His face was as cold and severe as Layla remembered, but now she met his gaze without flinching. She knew that he still held the power to decide her fate, but this time she would not be silent. The prosecutor delivered her opening remarks, painting Layla as a dangerous figure who had tried to exploit the system. Her words were laced with subtle prejudices, her tone one of calculated indifference, but Layla remained focused, unshaken. She knew that the prosecutor's arguments were based on the same flawed assumptions that had condemned her the first time. This time, she had come prepared to dismantle them. When it was Raymond's turn to speak, he stood up, his voice steady and resolute. He spoke of Layla's youth at the time of her arrest, of the mistakes and biases that had tainted the original investigation. He painted a picture of a child who had been wrongfully accused and silenced by a system that had refused to see her humanity. His words resonated through the courtroom, each one a reminder of the injustice she had endured. And then it was Layla's turn to testify. She stood, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room upon her, and took a deep breath. She thought of her parents, of their unwavering belief in justice, and she drew strength from their memory. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "I was 9 years old when I was arrested. I was just a child, scared and alone. But I was treated as if I were nothing more than a criminal. I didn't steal anything. I didn't even know those boys. But no one wanted to listen. They saw me, a black girl from a poor neighborhood, and they assumed the worst." Her voice wavered slightly, but she continued, holding the judge's gaze. "I've spent years in prison for something I didn't do. I've studied the law, learned everything I could, and I'm here today not just to ask for my freedom, but to ask for justice, for myself, and for everyone who's been wrongfully accused and silenced." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Layla saw a few sympathetic faces among the crowd. She looked over at Raymond, who nodded, his expression one of quiet pride. The prosecutor began her cross-examination, her questions pointed and hostile. She tried to paint Layla as manipulative, as someone who had only studied the law to deceive the court. But Layla met each question with calm resilience, refusing to be swayed or intimidated. She knew that this was her moment, her chance to finally tell her story, and she wouldn't let anyone take that from her. Throughout the trial, Raymond presented new evidence that hadn't been considered in the original case. Witnesses who had been ignored or dismissed were now called to testify, each one challenging the narrative that had been built around her. The officers who had arrested her were questioned about their methods, their biases exposed under Raymond's careful questioning. The store manager, who had been so quick to accuse her, was also called to the stand. His confidence wavered as Raymond questioned his assumptions, his failure to consider the possibility that Layla might have been innocent. Each piece of evidence, each testimony chipped away at the prosecutor's case, revealing the cracks in the foundation of her conviction. As the retrial drew to a close, Judge Collins called for closing statements. The prosecutor maintained her stance, arguing that the evidence was still sufficient to convict Layla. But Raymond's closing remarks resonated with a passion that filled the room. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying a depth of conviction, "this is not just about one girl's innocence. This is about the fairness of our system, about whether we, as a society, are willing to acknowledge our mistakes and seek justice. Layla was only a child, yet she was treated as though her life had no value. She was silenced, cast aside, and condemned. But today, she stands before you, not as a criminal, but as a young woman who has fought against overwhelming odds to prove her innocence." Raymond turned to the judge, his gaze unwavering. If we fail to correct this injustice, then we fail not only Layla, but everyone who believes in the principles of justice and fairness. I ask you, Your Honor, to consider the evidence, to consider the truth, and to grant Layla the freedom she deserves. The courtroom fell into silence as Judge Collins studied the faces before him. He glanced at Layla, his expression unreadable, before announcing that he would review the evidence and deliver his verdict the following day. That night, Layla lay awake in her cell, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The hours stretched on, each one filled with doubts and fears, memories of the years she had lost and the uncertainty of what awaited her. She thought of Raymond, of the support he had given her, and of the strength she had found within herself. The next morning, Layla returned to the courtroom, her hands trembling as she waited for Judge Collins to deliver his verdict. She glanced at Raymond, who offered her a reassuring smile and took a deep breath, bracing herself for whatever came next. Judge Collins cleared his throat, his gaze resting on Layla. After reviewing the evidence presented in this retrial, it is clear that the original investigation was marred by procedural errors and biases that call the legitimacy of the conviction into question. Given the new evidence and the compelling case presented by the defense, I find it appropriate to overturn the original sentence and declare Layla innocent of all charges. The words rang out like a symphony in Layla's ears. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and relief. She could barely believe it. She was free. After all the years of silence, of waiting, of fighting, she had finally been heard. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Layla felt tears streaming down her face as Raymond embraced her, his voice filled with pride. "You did it, Layla. You fought for yourself, and you won." For the first time in years, Layla walked out of the courthouse not as a prisoner, but as a free person. She stepped into the sunlight, feeling its warmth on her skin, the world around her vibrant and alive. She had reclaimed her life, her future, and she knew that she would never stop fighting, for herself and for everyone who still awaited justice. Layla's first day of freedom felt surreal. The world outside had changed in ways that both thrilled and frightened her. Colors seemed brighter, sounds sharper, and the air felt heavier with possibility. She had spent so many years behind cold, indifferent walls that now the vastness of the outside world felt both liberating and overwhelming. She took slow, steady steps, savoring each moment, each detail that she had longed to experience for so long. Every breath of fresh air was a reminder of the fight she had won, of the resilience that had carried her through the darkest days. As she walked away from the courthouse with Raymond by her side, she glanced at him, her expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching, "for everything." Raymond smiled, a look of pride and relief in his eyes. "You did this, Layla. You fought. I was just here to guide you." His words were simple, but they carried a depth of meaning that left Layla momentarily speechless. But despite the joy of her newfound freedom, Layla knew her journey wasn't over. The fight for her own justice had opened her eyes to a greater truth, that the system was deeply flawed, that there were countless others like her who had been wrongfully silenced, forgotten, or discarded. She had faced a system that had failed her, and now she felt a powerful urge to ensure that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. In the weeks that followed her release, Layla set to work rebuilding her life. She spent long hours in libraries, revisiting the books that had once been her lifeline, delving deeper into the complexities of law and human rights. She wanted to understand the full scope of the legal system, to master it, so she could use it as a tool to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She began volunteering at local organizations that offered legal aid to low-income families and marginalized communities. Her story had gained attention, and many people were eager to hear from the young woman who had defied the odds and exposed the injustice she had endured. Slowly, Layla's name became synonymous with resilience, her story a beacon of hope for those who felt forgotten by the world. During one of her volunteer shifts, she met Sarah, a young woman who had been wrongly accused of theft and had spent months in jail awaiting trial. Sarah's case echoed Layla's own in haunting ways, and Layla found herself compelled to help her. She spent hours with Sarah, listening to her story, offering support, and helping her build a strong defense. With Layla's guidance, Sarah's case was eventually dismissed, and she was set free. Each victory, each life Layla helped to reclaim, strengthened her resolve. She realized that her journey had given her a purpose far greater than herself, to bring justice to those who had been silenced, to fight for those who felt powerless. She had been given a second chance, and she was determined to use it to create change. Years passed, and Layla's dedication to her cause only grew. She studied relentlessly, passing her exams and finally achieving her dream of becoming a lawyer. Her reputation as a fierce advocate for the wrongfully accused spread, and her work attracted the attention of human rights organizations and legal advocates across the country. Layla became a leading voice in the fight against wrongful convictions, her own story serving as a powerful reminder of the need for reform. And then an opportunity arose that took her journey full circle. Layla was appointed as a judge specializing in human rights cases, a position that allowed her to address the very injustices she had once suffered. Her courtroom became a place where fairness and compassion reigned, where each case was treated with the dignity and respect it deserved. She listened to each story with an open heart, her own experiences guiding her decisions, reminding her of the importance of empathy and understanding. One afternoon, Layla was reviewing her caseload when a familiar name caught her eye: Carter. The file detailed the case of a young man, Derek Carter, who had been accused of assault. As she read further, Layla realized that Derek was the son of Officer Max Carter, the very man who had arrested her all those years ago. The irony was striking, and for a moment, Layla felt a rush of conflicting emotions. The memory of Carter's harsh words, his dismissive treatment, still lingered in her mind. But as she read the file, she reminded herself of the principles that had guided her journey. Derek Carter's case was riddled with inconsistencies. The evidence against him was flimsy, and it was clear that he, too, had been subjected to a prejudiced investigation. The young man was facing years in prison for a crime he likely hadn't committed. Layla felt a surge of empathy, remembering the fear and helplessness she had once felt in his position. When Derek entered the courtroom, Layla studied him closely. He was young, around the same age she had been when she was wrongfully accused, and his face was etched with fear and frustration. She knew that look well. It was the look of someone who had been treated as guilty long before they'd had a chance to prove their innocence. As the trial unfolded, Layla listened intently, carefully assessing the evidence and testimonies. She scrutinized every detail, her own memories guiding her as she searched for the truth. And as the trial came to a close, she realized that Derek, like her, was a victim of a system that had judged him unfairly. When the time came for her verdict, Layla spoke with the same calm conviction she had found within herself all those years ago. The evidence presented is insufficient to support the charges against Derek Carter, she declared. This court finds the defendant not guilty. A wave of relief washed over Derek's face, and as he looked up at her, Layla saw gratitude in his eyes. She felt a sense of closure, a moment of redemption that transcended her own past. She had been given a chance to extend the compassion that she had once been denied, to uphold the justice that had eluded her for so long. That evening, Layla sat alone in her office, reflecting on her journey. She had come so far from the scared, vulnerable girl who had once been silenced by the system. Her life had been shaped by hardship, but it had also been filled with resilience, with a purpose that had carried her through the darkest of times. She knew that her fight for justice was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As she gazed out the window, the city lights sparkling in the distance, Layla felt a profound sense of peace. She had reclaimed her voice, her life, and her future. And she knew, deep within her heart, that she would continue to fight for justice, to be a beacon for those who needed it most. Her parents' dreams for her, their lessons of kindness, resilience, and strength, had come to life within her. Layla was no longer a victim. She was a symbol of hope, of justice, and of the power that lay within each person to rise above even the greatest injustices. Thank you for watching to the end. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and let me know in the comments which moment of this video you remember most.